My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 41 years old. For nearly 2 decades, I've worked in logistics operations, helping businesses clean up their internal messes before they collapse under their own weight. I don't wear expensive suits. I don't give motivational speeches. I work in numbers, pressure points, and long games. I wasn't born into wealth. I didn't inherit anything. But I've learned how to build. Quietly. Precisely. Last year, I was invited to a family dinner, not because they missed me, but because they couldn't avoid it. It was at my uncle's house, founder and CEO of Hale Freight Group, a man who built a small trucking company into a regional player and made sure everyone at the table remembered whose name was on the company sign. We sat around a long oak table, carved centerpiece, linen napkins, forced smiles. My cousins talked shop, numbers, routes, vendors, delays. I listened. Same issues I'd solved for bigger companies with half their overhead and none of their drama. At one point, someone laughed and said, "Marcus doesn't really get how family business works." I smiled politely. Not because I agreed, but because I already knew something they didn't. 6 months earlier, their biggest lender defaulted on a silent loan arrangement. The debt changed hands. Quietly. Legally. Without fanfare. I was the buyer. They hadn't read the fine print. They didn't know the terms. But I did. They saw me as an outsider. The corporate cousin. The one who did something with tech and lives out of hotels. Not one of them. And that was fine. Because while they laughed over dry turkey and old stories, I was already holding the one asset they couldn't joke their way out of. Control. 3 weeks after that dinner, I scheduled a meeting with Hale Freight's board. No press, no warning, just a formal request from the company's newest debt holder. Me. I walked into the room 10 minutes early. No tie. Calm. Observing. The boardroom looked just like I remembered it. Same framed certificates on the wall. Same outdated espresso machine no one ever used. But this time, I wasn't sitting on the sidelines. I wasn't asking for a chance. I wasn't waiting to be heard. This time, I pulled out a chair at the head of the table. One by one, the directors arrived. Most of them barely concealed their confusion. My uncle walked in last, eyes narrowed. He gave me a polite smile, the kind people use when they don't know why you're there. But they know they're not going to like the reason. "Marcus," he said, "didn't realize you'd be joining us today." I returned the smile. Thought it was time I sat in on a conversation that affects my investment. Silence. Small. Sharp. I opened the folder in front of me. As of last quarter, Hale Freight carries a leveraged debt position of $4.7 million. The note was transferred to my holding company last month. I'm not here to disrupt. I'm here to protect my interest, just like any of you. They weren't ready. Not for the language, not for the preparation, not for me. One board member leaned forward. "So, what exactly is your plan?" I paused. Not for drama, for precision. My plan is to keep this company from collapsing under its own ego, starting with the part where you treat someone who holds your debt like a distant relative instead of a partner. I looked across the table. For years, you saw me as someone who didn't belong here, but the seat was always mine. You just never thought I'd pull it out myself. It didn't take long for the first one to fold. Gerald Long, Chief Operating Officer, 32 years in the company. My uncle's right hand. The kind of man who never answered emails directly, but always copied someone else to do it for him. He saw me as a nuisance when I walked in. By the end of our third meeting, he saw me as a threat. I didn't raise my voice, didn't swing my weight. I just asked questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Why were we renewing vendor contracts 12% above market rate? Why had driver turnover doubled while HR expenses tripled? And why, despite years of profitability, was the company now dependent on emergency credit lines to cover quarterly payroll? He dodged, deflected, fumbled. I waited, listened, documented. By the time I presented the internal audit to the board, the facts spoke louder than I ever needed to. The numbers weren't just inefficient, they were negligent. Gerald resigned the next morning. No big announcement. No email blast. Just an HR notice circulated quietly. Pursuing new opportunities. The board didn't ask questions. They thought it would appease me. They thought trimming fat would buy them time. But I wasn't looking to be appeased. I was rebalancing the structure. And Gerald was just the first. I kept my tone neutral, my actions clinical. Not because I lacked emotion, but because emotion wasn't useful here. Everyone expected a storm. Instead, I gave them silence, efficiency, decisions that landed like whispers but changed everything. A quiet exit says more than a dramatic one. It signals control, and it reminds the room. No one is untouchable, especially not in a family business that forgot what accountability looks like. While they scrambled to regroup, I got to work. Quietly, precisely, out of sight. I didn't need titles. I didn't want applause. I wanted structure and leverage. Gerald's departure had rattled the board, but not enough to change them. They still saw me as temporary, a disruption, a phase that would pass if they kept their heads down long enough. So I let them think that. Let them believe I was satisfied with one resignation and a few polite meetings. Meanwhile, I was redrawing the blueprint, one piece at a time. I met privately with middle management, the ones who actually kept the operation running. I listened, asked the questions no one ever asked them. What's broken? Where's the waste? Who's been overlooked? They told me everything, not because they were loyal, but because no one had ever asked. Not my uncle, not the board, just me. In parallel, I brought in my own team, quietly. Contractors, consultants, analysts I trusted. We worked off-site, secure documents, clean reports, nothing flashy. While the board argued over holiday bonuses, I restructured the logistics division. While they debated whether to cut fuel reimbursements, I renegotiated shipping contracts under a new subsidiary, one they didn't even know I controlled. The profits flowed differently now. Cleaner, tighter, protected. By the time they noticed, the balance sheet had shifted. Margins up, waste down. And yet, none of them could quite explain how. They called it a market rebound. Good timing. Luck. I didn't correct them, because the most effective power doesn't walk in shouting. It builds in the shadows. And when the lights finally come on, everyone realizes too late who's actually running the room. I've always trusted numbers more than people. People lie. People forget. Numbers don't. So when the quarterly report came in 2 weeks early, marked preliminary in big red letters, I read it 3 times. Not because it was impressive, but because something felt wrong. Top-line revenue looked strong. Too strong. Margins were up. Operating costs were down. It was the kind of report designed to impress the board. And maybe that's exactly what it was. I cross-checked it against internal purchase orders, driver reports, freight claims, fuel logs. And that's when the patterns cracked. Some vendor invoices were listed twice. Mileage reports had been adjusted with no source. And one division, Southeast Distribution, showed a 19% drop in payroll cost, without a single layoff. That was impossible. I didn't panic, Didn't send an email or make a scene. I just picked up the phone and called an old contact from a supply chain audit firm. She owed me a favor. 3 days later, I had a quiet report delivered straight to my inbox. No headers, no signatures, just facts. Someone inside Hale Freight was cooking the books, not to steal, but to survive. Massaging losses into wins, covering mismanagement with creative formatting. And the author of the spreadsheet? The CFO, my cousin Daniel. The same one who used to laugh when I said every decimal matters. The one who told me, years ago, that family businesses are about trust, not balance sheets. Apparently, they'd trusted him right into the red. I didn't make a call, didn't march into his office. I just circled the numbers, filed the report, and added one more name to the list of exits to come. Because when the numbers don't add up, someone eventually does. Leverage isn't noise. It's silence you control. It's what you don't say until it matters. After Daniel's creative accounting came to light, I didn't confront him. Not yet. I let him keep presenting glowing reports, smiling through board meetings, offering firm handshakes like a man with nothing to hide. He didn't know I'd already handed his doctored figures to Brian Keller, the external auditor they'd shelved 2 years ago to cut unnecessary expenses. Brian owed me a favor. I cashed it in with one email. Within 72 hours, the cracks in the financials became chasms, improper classifications, deferred losses, forecasted earnings based on non-existent contracts. They hadn't just padded the books, they'd built a fantasy. And Daniel was the architect. I showed the board the preliminary audit results at the next meeting. No theatrics, no raised voice, just a single sentence. These numbers aren't real. Silence followed. Then the deflection began. It's probably just a reporting error. We can revise before filing. Daniel's always had a handle on things. I waited. Let them talk. Then I dropped the final page of the audit on the table, the one that tied Daniel's personal expense account to a consulting firm he privately owned. A firm paid nearly $200,000 over the past 18 months for services no one could define. My uncle stood up, angry, red-faced. "This is a family matter," he snapped. "No," I replied. "This is a governance issue." He stared at me, realizing, too late, that I wasn't making a suggestion. I was stating fact. The board voted that afternoon to place Daniel on administrative leave pending investigation. 6 votes for, 1 abstention. My uncle. That's the thing about leverage. You only need to use it once. But when you do, it shifts the entire table. The first time I walked into the building after Daniel's suspension, no one looked me in the eye. Not because they feared me, because they didn't know what I was yet. I wasn't the CEO, wasn't on payroll, didn't hold a title that made sense to their org chart. But doors opened, conversations paused, emails got reread before they were sent. Ownership looks different now, not the loud, performative kind. Not my uncle's gold-plated name on the corner office, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up early, reads every line, and never raises a hand unless it needs to. They used to say I wasn't one of them. Too distant, too formal, too outside. But now I walked through that building and knew every pain point. I knew which vendor overcharged for steel shelving, which dispatcher played favorites, which regional manager hadn't updated a delivery log in 3 weeks, and more than that, I knew which people in this building still cared, who showed up even when leadership didn't, who carried the weight while someone else collected the praise. Ownership isn't about inheritance, it's about responsibility, about listening more than talking. fixing more than blaming. My uncle hadn't been back since the vote. He'd retreated into silence, hoping the company would stall without him, that someone would beg him to come fix it. No one did. The board moved forward. Payroll stabilized. We brought in a fractional CFO to replace Daniel's signature with someone who could count. And quietly, I started drafting a new structure. Not for me. For the people who actually kept this business alive. The janitor who knew more about fleet activity than half the managers. The dispatcher who handled triple the workload without complaint. The driver who paid out of pocket to replace a damaged tail light just to avoid delays. They didn't need a king. They needed a compass. And ownership, real ownership, is about direction. It happened on a Tuesday. No press release, no security escorts, just 3 letters, sealed and ready. Laid out on a conference table in the boardroom at 8 a.m. My uncle arrived last. Late, as usual. Still dressing like the business was his, even though the number said otherwise. Daniel walked in behind him. No eye contact. The third was Margaret, head of internal operations. She'd once told me my audit questions felt aggressive. That was her word. Aggressive. As if facts had a tone. They took their seats without speaking. No greetings. No small talk. I placed the envelopes in front of each of them. Neatly, evenly spaced. Just like I'd planned. "What's this?" my uncle asked, already annoyed. "Closure," I said. He didn't open his right away. Margaret did. Daniel hesitated, scanning mine for any sign of weakness. He found none. Each envelope contained the same 3 things: a termination letter, a breakdown of their severance agreements, and a personal note, handwritten. Brief, professional, unemotional. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cruel. But I was done. For years, they'd treated the company like a family heirloom, untouchable, inherited, and entitled. They wore ownership like a birthright, even as they hollowed out the core. They thought firing them would feel personal. It didn't. It felt necessary. When my uncle stood to speak, I raised my hand gently. "No negotiations," I said. "This isn't revenge. It's repair." Daniel muttered something under his breath. I didn't ask him to repeat it, because in that room, on that day, his voice no longer mattered. They left slowly, like people walking away from something they never truly respected. I stayed behind, picked up the empty envelopes, filed them away. Sometimes, leadership means saying nothing until it's time to say no. And on that day, I did. After they were gone, the silence changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. For the first time in years, the building didn't feel like a mausoleum for old ego. It felt like a company again. I walked through each department over the next 2 weeks. No clipboard, no entourage. Just me and a notepad. I asked questions, listened, took my time. People looked up when I passed, not because they were afraid, but because they were finally being seen. The myth of the Hale family dynasty had always been built on noise. Big talk, big gestures, big failures disguised as calculated risks. But the truth was simpler. It had been carried for years by people no one ever bothered to thank. So I started writing a new chapter, not in headlines or memos, but in structure. We reworked the bonus system to reward actual performance, not proximity to a last name. We opened up internal training for leadership roles. No more nepotism. We reviewed every outdated contract, every vendor relationship, every handshake deal made in someone's golf cart. And then I did the one thing no one expected. I renamed the holding company, not out of anger, not to erase anything, but to mark a clear line between what had been and what was now. Hale Freight became Maris Transit and Logistics, a nod to my mother's name. She never got a seat at the table, so I gave her the name on the door. The board approved the change unanimously. They knew why, and they agreed. Legacy isn't a statue. It's not bloodline. It's what you build when no one's clapping, and you do it anyway. That day, I walked past the old office, the one with my uncle's name still faintly etched on the door glass. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Because legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you write, in silence and stone. I didn't set out to take over. I didn't crave their respect. I stopped needing their approval a long time ago. What I wanted, what I'd always wanted, was to belong on my own terms. Not as someone's cousin, not as a token outsider at the Thanksgiving table, but as a builder, a contributor, as someone who didn't just carry the name, but carried the weight. They never saw that, because they weren't looking. They saw my distance as detachment, my quiet as weakness, my independence as betrayal. But here's the truth. I was always family. They just didn't see it. Not until the reports balanced. Not until the trucks ran smoother. Not until the contracts were renegotiated, the fraud cleaned out, and the company, their company, was no longer bleeding. They didn't see me until I was the one keeping the lights on. And even then, they resented it. But I didn't need a round of applause, didn't need an apology. The company's success became the proof, the calm in the warehouse, the efficiency in the logistics chain, the sense, finally, that someone was steering with intention. That was enough. 6 months after the restructure, Hale Freight, now Maris Transit, posted its strongest quarter in 5 years. Not flashy, not viral, just solid, predictable growth. The kind that keeps employees fed and operations stable. I stood in the background during the quarterly update. Let the leadership team, the new leadership team, handle the spotlight. Most of them had once been ignored, overlooked, like me. Now they were running the show. That was the point. Because power isn't always about taking control. Sometimes it's about making room. And for the first time in this company's history, the room finally had space for people like me. Not by invitation, but by design.